Oh my. Omicron. Omicron. We've had a weekend to absorb all of the information we've now got about the Omicron variant. To be honest, it's all still fairly unconfirmed. But we can now look at our government, say, does it look like we are ready for this new variant? I don't know. We're going to discuss that tonight. I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. How are you doing, Ash?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm feeling kind of zen about this new variant. I feel like we kind of know what's coming. The vaccines are basically going to work. Could be a little bit awkward, but it's not the end of the world. Where are you at?
Well, yeah,
Emotionally?
I think I feel zen, but for a different reason. My feeling is I am just a floating leaf on the stagnant pond of history. You know, that's just how I'm feeling.
Yeah, I think it's good.
I'm
Good
not
to walk.
fighting it.
Good to walk
I'm
through
not raging.
life with that attitude. Lower the stakes. That's what I say. And we'll be talking to an expert in South Africa, obviously at the heart of the storm when it comes to this variant, but also we speak about how that country and that region has been let down by the West. We will also, of course, tonight talk about Keir Starmer's reshuffle. It sort of started with a bang this morning. Very controversial, the circumstances in which that reshuffle started, but it's now kind of, it dragged on a little bit. But I think we're going to have enough information to do a good segment on that. We've also got Nadine Dorries and Piers Corbyn, two great little sections for you there. You know the score. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. And we do want to know your comments and your questions. You can tweet them on the hashtag TiskiSour or put them in the comments box. The emergence of the Omicron variant of coronavirus has jolted governments around the world into action. And this weekend, Boris Johnson attempted to present himself as a leader on top of his brief.
So yesterday we took steps to protect the UK against the variant coming here from southern African countries, and earlier today added 4 more countries to the red list. But we now need to go further and implement a proportionate testing regime for arrivals from across the whole world. So we're not going to stop people travelling. I want to stress that. We're not going to stop people travelling, but we will require anyone who enters the UK to take a PCR test by the end of the second day after their arrival and to self-isolate until they have a negative result.
The effectiveness of a day 2 PCR test has been questioned by the Scottish and Welsh governments. Both have come out in favour of a day 8 test and 8 days isolation. That makes a lot of sense given the incubation period of COVID-19. It's a lot longer than 2 days. However, regardless of what we do with our borders, it seems likely there are already multiple cases of Omicron in Britain. 11 people have already been identified with the variant, many of whom have not travelled to southern Africa, meaning community transmission has clearly taken place. That all means that to keep community transmission under control, England is reintroducing face masks in shops and on public transport. That brings England into line with Scotland and Wales. The Westminster government have, however, stopped short of implementing their so-called Plan B. That would include vaccine passports and a request for people to work from home. That latter omission was the subject of an interesting exchange between Andrew Marr and Sajid Javid on Sunday.
Do you think people should work from home where possible?
No, I don't think that's necessary.
Why not?
Because this is about taking proportionate action against the risks that we face. And I think what we have set out yesterday and a couple of days before that on the red listing, these are the appropriate, responsible things to do.
The reason I ask about that is SAGE, your advisors, are very, very clear. They say reintroduction of working from home guidance is likely to have the greatest individual impact on transmission out of the proposed measures, and yet you've ruled it out.
Well, I think our scientific advisors, whether they're SAGE or others, that's their job. They give advice. Ministers need to decide. And one thing, by the way, ministers need to
ignore it. I mean,
well, our job is to take account of any scientific advice and then decide. And let's remember, in the past when we've taken such actions, they also come with a really heavy cost on the economy, on people's social lives, on their mental health. And I've seen so many problems in the NHS that were non-COVID COVID problems, caused by previous lockdowns and things. So, that's not of interest to me.
That's not of interest to me. That's quite a bold statement when it comes to working from home. What SAGE have said would be the most effective thing to do when it comes to limiting community transmission. I'd also, I would have liked Andrew Marr to ask him that. So you say you've been in hospitals and you've seen all of these people having problems because of measures such as working from home where possible. I mean, lots of elements of lockdown have enormous consequences for our mental health, for our physical health. Being told that if possible work from home, I don't buy it. It is, of course, worth emphasising we still know very little about this variant, and there has been speculation that while being more transmissible and evading vaccines, Omicron could be relatively mild. Those making that argument have cited Dr. Angelique Coetzee. She is the South African doctor who first spotted the new variant. Here she is explaining to the BBC what happened after a man in his early 30s came to her clinic suffering from extreme tiredness, a headache and a scratchy throat.
Because it's unusual for that specific person to present with this type of symptoms, I decided to test. We do rapid testing in our surgeries, and I did a rapid test and it was positive. I then tested the rest of his family and it's all positive. Every one of them very, very mild symptoms, and that is what we call mild symptoms. And then for the rest of the day, I actually saw more patients coming in with the same sort of symptoms. They all tested positive. What we are seeing clinically in South Africa, and remember, I'm at the epicenter, that's where I'm practicing, is extremely mild. For us, that's mild cases. We haven't admitted anyone. I spoke to other colleagues of mine, the same picture.
People have been taking heart from Dr. Coetzee's description of these cases as mild. However, we shouldn't get too carried away. Every variant of COVID has so far been mild for people in their early 30s. We are going to have to wait and see how it affects people who are more vulnerable. We just don't know that much. We're also going to have to wait to find out to what degree Omicron might evade existing vaccines. The Chief Medical Officer of Moderna, Paul Burton, explained to Marr the time frame for any update were we to need it.
We should know about the ability of the current vaccine to provide protection in the next couple of weeks. But the remarkable thing about the mRNA vaccines, the Moderna platform, is that we can move very fast.
Lots of people will be imagining you and your colleagues putting the Thanksgiving turkey to one side, going back to work at short notice to do this, and then will be asking themselves, OK, if we need it, when will we get the new Omicron vaccine from Moderna into our arms? How soon might it be available?
If we have to make a brand new vaccine, I think that's going to be early 2022 before that's really going to be available in large quantities.
So that's promising. We could have updated vaccines at the start of next year. In the meantime, the UK government has announced plans to open up the booster programme to all adults in Britain and to reduce the time between second and third doses from 6 to 3 months. The decision followed advice from the JCVI, which is the UK's vaccine advisor. Professor Weishi Lem, who chairs the body, explained the logic in a press conference earlier today.
One way of reducing the impact of this mismatch between vaccine and variant is to increase the strength of the immune response provided by the current vaccine. In other words, if we can raise the level of the immune response generated by the vaccine, that higher level of immune response will reach out and provide extra protection to mismatched variants. And that is what we can do, fortunately, because we know that with the mRNA vaccines, the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and to a lesser extent, the AstraZeneca vaccine, a boost of these vaccines provides a very, very strong immune response. The immune response provided with the boost is measured to be higher than the immune response attained after the second dose. So there's a stepwise increase. And this increase in the immune response will broaden the protection, hopefully also against the new variant.
That was Professor Wei Shen Lim explaining the recommendations of the JCVI. It is important to note that just because all adults will now become eligible for boosters after 3 months of their second dose, that doesn't necessarily mean we'll all get them immediately. I got a little bit overexcited when I first got that update to my phone. In fact, it's now up to the NHS to decide when to invite people depending on their age and priority. All perfectly reasonable, to be honest. Ash, we've all had a weekend to dwell on the Omicron variant. Lots is still unknown. There's a limit to the amount of speculation we can do about the features of the virus. But what's your verdict on our government's response so far?
Okay, so first, the welcome bit of news, which is this expansion of the booster rollout. We know that there's waning effectiveness the longer you go on from when you've had your jabs. Particularly, there have been problems with AstraZeneca and the Delta variant. So I think having the expanded booster program is wise, and it's become even more urgent because of this potentially more vaccine-resistant variant popping up in South Africa. So that's a really good thing. There are, unfortunately, some really bad things. First is this refusal to countenance a return to working from home where possible. There's one reason and one reason only why the Conservative Party is reluctant to do that, and that's because their, major donors are property developers, are commercial landlords. They are in hock to material interests which directly conflict with the demands of health preservation. As Andrew Marr pointed out, Sage has said it is the single biggest and most effective individual measure that this government can take. It is relatively non-intrusive in the sense that it still means that we all get to do the things we want to do. We get to socialize, we get to go out, we get to go to restaurants. It's just breaking the office as a particular hub of transmission. They don't want to do that because it conflicts materially with their donors. And also, I think there is a sense of ideological opposition that when you give people greater flexibility, when you prioritize people's well-being over the interests of those material interests, you stray away from conservative values. I also think that the instructions at the moment, which is that you only have to self-isolate if you're a close contact of somebody who has the Omicron variant, is potentially risky. So I don't know how many PCR tests regularly get the sort of sequencing which allows you to identify between variants. It might be that as a precautionary measure, it's better to return to the old style of self-isolating where household contacts self-isolate for 10 days along with the person who is confirmed to have the virus. I would dread that happening. I personally really wouldn't like it, but it might be the safer thing to do. It might be the thing which preserves in-person teaching and, like Christmas being fun. So I think that would be another thing to look at. And then the third thing is the grotesque level of sick pay that we have in this country. So right now, sick pay is still under £100 a week. It is not enough for people to live on. And if what you want to do is incentivize people to get tested, even if they have just an inkling that they might have coronavirus, if you want to incentivize them being able to stay at home to protect their colleagues and people in the outside world, then you do have to have statutory sick pay set at a much higher level, at least a level that you can survive on, with some level of dignity. And until the government takes that measure, I think that we will be fatally hamstrung in our pandemic management, whether it's for coronavirus or something else down the line, because you can't get people to make a choice between paying their bills and protecting other people. That's not a real choice, and it's something which endangers everybody.
Some interesting points there. I mean, I definitely agree with the working from home thing, because they say I can imagine an argument which sort of involves mental health where you say, look, we're not going to tell people they can't go to work, because while for lots of people they like to work from home, for many people that might be the only social contact they have. So we don't want to ban that. But what you would say is, what we absolutely want to say is any worker who would prefer to work from home or who is happy to work from home, they should do that. And we will be telling bosses that they have to give maximum leeway to their workers to work wherever they want. If you don't want to come into the office, no boss should be pressuring a worker to come into the office unless they're in a frontline job. Be a very easy thing for the health secretary to say. That is not going to damage anyone's mental health. If he was a health secretary who cared about our health, that's what he would be saying. I think on the self-isolation, I maybe differ with you slightly, because I think if we went back to a situation where, you had to self-isolate for 10 days if you'd been in contact with anyone with any kind of COVID-19. I do think that that's going to be quite difficult to enforce at this point. We're double jabbed. Many of us will be triple jabbed soon. And also we have 50,000 cases a day. So there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be asked to self-isolate for 10 days. So I imagine that's going to be lots of people turning off their app, refusing to answer the phone from NHS Test and Trace. So I feel like the situation we've got at the moment where you're encouraged to get a PCR test, I'd say it shouldn't be, you might like to get a PCR test. I'd say you've been in contact with someone, go get that PCR test right now and then take a lateral flow test every 2 days. I think that's a slightly more reasonable ask to make of people. Although, I mean, you're right, it should definitely be looked at. The working from home thing though, absolutely. I was thinking this morning, what does this new variant change in terms of sort of the positions I hold and what I would advocate for? And my conclusion was kind of not very much. Like this whole time, ever since we've had the vaccine, what I've been in favor of is those things which I think are sustainable, which we can basically introduce without reducing sort of the health of our social lives, without, severely damaging our quality of life, but which will limit the transmission of COVID-19 and also limit the transmission of all communicable diseases, because we don't, or at least respiratory ones, we don't want any of them. So sick pay, if you're sick, ventilation in schools and ventilation in any indoor space, these are just things that we should just have in general, and that we haven't invested in them at this point is just, it's bonkers. And yeah, I would also go for masks in places where it's not too, it's not too invasive for that to happen. It doesn't really damage your experience of being on the tube or being in a supermarket to wear a mask. I think teachers have every right to say that their kids should be wearing masks in class. They have put themselves in harm's way more than really any of us at this point in time. So I think that demand's completely reasonable. We'll probably debate a few more of these policies in one moment. First of all, I want to show you another clip. Professor Wei Shen Lim spoke in that press conference earlier. That's what we showed you before. Also speaking at that conference was Jonathan Van Tam. He's become famous for explaining COVID developments in analogies. This was his latest attempt.
So to me, and as you know, I love football, we started with 11 players in the team with the Wuhan vaccine. And you could say that we've kind of picked up a couple of injuries when Alpha came along and then Delta came along, those variants that are slightly different from the Wuhan original strain. And we've had to use our subs off the bench to keep us in the game, but we're well in the game. And you can see that with the current epidemiology in relation to Delta, that the vaccines are holding up very well and largely keeping us out of trouble. Now, Omicron is like now picking up a couple of yellow cards to key players on top. We may be okay, but we're kind of starting to feel at risk that we might go down to 10 players. And if that happens, or if that's a risk that it's going to happen, then we need everyone on the pitch to up their game in the meantime. And that's really upping your game in terms of boosters and in terms of antibody responses. We're not going to wait for the red card to happen. We're going to act decisively now, and we're asking everyone to up their game. We're asking everyone to play their part in the urgency now of the booster programme coming forward the moment you are called by the NHS. It's really, frankly, never been more vital that the booster campaign has never been more vital than at this point in time.
That was Jonathan Van Tam. I mean, sometimes his analogies have, helped people understand what's going on. Ash, I want to bring you in on this because you watch more football than me. Did that make any sense, or did that just make what should be quite a simple point incredibly complicated?
I mean, it made it incredibly complicated. I would say there was something a little bit self-indulgent about torturing this poor laboured metaphor. I mean, really, it should be considered a crime against the Geneva Convention. I think we all know what the emergence of a new variant is, and we don't necessarily need an elaborate sporting analogy.
It was 1 minute and 35 seconds, really long.
It's a really long analogy. I mean, maybe you could have done something with like F1 and thinking about something's gone wrong, but you're not disqualified. It's like a grid penalty, so you've got to work a bit harder, maybe. I've been watching a lot of F1. I'm sorry, Michael. It's on the brain.
It always surprises me how much F1 you watched. I wanted to get that. We've got a lot of clips to get through, which is why I jumped to that. But I realised I should give you an opportunity, if you wanted to push back against my idea that maybe getting people to self-isolate for 10 days if they've been a contact is too demanding. What's your take on that?
The reason why I'm suggesting that is because I don't know what proportion of PCR tests get the regular genomic sequencing. So in the absence of what I see as a really aggressive contact tracing program where you are empowering local councils to impose some degrees of local measures in order to geographically contain outbreaks, then I think, well, what's the next best thing? It was announced quite a few months ago that now is around the time where they were thinking of scaling back some of the test and trace operations. So in the absence of something which I think is really important, which is being able to have a level of monitoring of outbreaks of the Omicron variant, and also having local councils and posts to take action quite swiftly so you can avoid national measures, then the next best one along is saying self-isolate household contacts at the very least.
Until we work out what the hell is going on. I can see the argument for it.
What the hell is going on?
Yeah, apparently they can tell with most tests if the Omicron variant is around because I'm not even going to try and explain it, but I'm not going to try and pretend that I understand it more than try and explain it. It's not that it's so complicated. It's that I haven't quite got my head around it. But something like an S gene falls out.
There's something to do with the letter S. That's what I read from the Robert Peston thread as well.
Yeah.
I didn't understand it, but I did read it.
Look out for the letter S, guys.
Journalism you can get from Novara Media. Go to novara.media/support and maybe you can fund 2 smarter hosts.
Yeah, so the S drops out. That's all I've heard. Right. I want to move to another COVID story today because I did have a massive facepalm reading the news this morning, and it was reading specifically about the Vaccine Manufacturing Innovation Centre. Now, you might remember last year we heard a lot about this new manufacturing hub. It was supposed to prevent any shortages during a future wave or if we ever needed to produce vaccines for variants or even, heaven forbid, a future pandemic. Last September, on a visit to the site, Boris Johnson said the following to that effect. So he said, when open, the VMIC will be able to manufacture enough vaccine doses for the whole UK population in as little as 6 months, which would transform how we beat this virus and prepare for future pandemics. Now, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? It sounds like a government that's being proactive to stop future lockdowns, to stop future pandemics destroying our lives for 2 years. Well, it's now up for sale. So the FT explain the decision as follows. They say the need for a state-backed vaccine manufacturing centre has waned as pharmaceutical companies have stepped in to meet demand for COVID-19 jabs. That's according to people familiar with the VMIC sale process. Quote, the worry was there would be a surge in vaccine manufacturing requirements during the pandemic and we'd need surge capacity and that reason is gone, unquote, said one person familiar with the efforts to offload the VMIC to the private sector. Now, you can't read that without thinking, what the fuck? We're currently discussing whether we'll need more restrictions because of a variant which emerged due to a shortage of vaccines in many parts of the world. We've just seen there, the guy from Moderna saying we might have to tweak these vaccines and then it will take a little while for us to roll this out. Clearly, as we've seen from the past year, Moderna, Pfizer are not going to be able to make enough vaccines so that there is an abundance and we're not competing with other countries and you have this sort of horrible situation of vaccine nationalism where there isn't enough for any. And that's the situation in which the government has decided, oh, no, Big Pharma, they've got it all under control. This massive, flagship vaccine manufacturing hub that we were going to create that was going to be state-backed so that it sort of produces vaccines according to the priorities of democratically elected governments. No, we don't need that. We don't need that. This thing's over. Like, what are these people thinking, right? Anyway, the FT sort of goes on to explain why these people don't think this is needed anymore. So this is the reason given for selling this thing off. So the FT report. The person added that additional investment was needed to complete the VMIC, and this could come from a buyer. The government has put at least £250 million into the project for UK Research and Development, a state funding agency, and could now look to recoup some of that investment through the sale process. So we're selling this off because we've already invested £215 million and we want to get that back. You know, £250 million, quite a lot to invest in a mass vaccination factory when we're still in the middle of a pandemic. Like this is insane, right? So according to the National Audit Office, the COVID pandemic has already cost the government £370 billion. £370 billion. And now someone in government has decided that £215 million is too much to spend on, you know, the one thing that gets us out of pandemics without us all having to have like a miserable life for years. It's bananas. And I've seen lots of people talk about this on Twitter, lots of wonky people, lots of people who aren't, you know, like mad lefty Corbynites like myself. Everyone is looking at this thinking like, this is, you know, just the most blatant example of the government shooting itself in the foot. And in the process, I mean, you know, shooting us all in the foot, because if we don't have enough vaccines for the next pandemic or for the next variant, it seems like this is going to be, you know, it's their fault. It's an active decision to save £215 million. I mean, Ash, do you have any insiders in the Treasury who made this make sense? Like, well, I haven't seen anyone defend this, by the way.
Well, look, James Butler, I think, in a piece about Johnsonomics, quoted the Treasury mindset thusly, which is they have the view that spending money like eating people is always wrong. So you end up in a position where you've got pressure, not just from the fiscal hawks within the Conservative Party, but from within the Treasury itself, to cut back on day-to-day costs, whether or not those cutbacks represent a genuine saving, like, for instance, not just splashing out your expensive test and trace contracts to somebody that you met in the pub, or whether it's a false economy. So, for instance, flogging off a centre which could help research, develop vaccines, not just for the coronavirus pandemic, but for future pandemics, that would represent, I think, a false economy. Because sure, 215 million, if you're not really doing anything, is a lot of money. You're like, okay, well, this hasn't really contributed very much. But when you need it, and when you've got the infrastructure in place to carry out that research, to develop a vaccine faster than anyone else, and to do it rather than in the private sector, you know, so it's walled up by patents, but with the potential to democratize those vaccines and share them around the world, then it looks a lot less like a false economy. It looks like a real investment in our future. But that's not the mindset which is either at the Treasury, and it's not the mindset within bits of the government, particularly the bits which are led by Rishi Sunak and his allies.
Mind-blowing. And we got a few good comments and pushback against something I said. Stephen Everson tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour. Michael Walker says that we shouldn't ask people to isolate if they come into contact with anyone who tests positive, because with 40 to 50,000 new cases a day, this would cover too many people. But the point would precisely be to bring that intolerable number down. So I suppose, you know, I would respond to that. If I were to believe that that would significantly bring that number down, like really significantly bring it down, I would agree with you. I think at this point, with so much COVID-19 around, and also with so many people who are double vaccinated and don't really think they're, you know, that sensitive to it. If you've just been boosted with a good mRNA vaccine, you are quite protected against catching it. So sort of telling people to self-isolate, I think, is not necessarily going to have too much impact on levels of the virus, and it is going to make, you know, COVID-19 just a much bigger burden than it already is. Yes, I know, you know, the biggest burden of COVID is people going to hospital and people dying. At the same time, the vaccines have dramatically reduced the likelihood of that for all of us, essentially. And especially if people get their boosters. The boosters really do work. On Van Tam's elaborate football analogies, Tad Cantwell says, so Omicron is like when Irish Gaelic football plays against an Aussie rules team with compromised rules, causing lots of injuries. Got it, thanks. Now, I assume the joke here is that analogy doesn't really make any sense, and it's not just I have a lack of understanding of both Irish Gaelic football and Aussie rules football, which means that I don't understand it, but I'm guessing that's a joke in itself. If you are enjoying the video, do hit that like button. Next story. The emergence of the Omicron variant has led to a heated debate as to whether vaccine apartheid is to blame. Scientists have been consistently warning that until we vaccinate the whole world, dangerous new variants will continue to emerge, and Omicron seems to fit that pattern. The variant was first identified in South Africa, where only 24% of the population are fully vaccinated, and the first identified specimen of Omicron was from Botswana, where 20% are fully vaccinated. That compares to 68% in the UK. That Omicron is the West's selfishness coming back to bite us is a point that has been made forcefully by, among others, Gordon Brown. He blames the new variant on the West hoarding vaccines and even destroying surplus doses instead of passing them on. The New York Times' COVID reporter has also echoed that sentiment. She tweeted, "The new variant is exactly what the experts I've talked to have warned about over and over again. While we are busy boosting already vaccinated young people, leaving millions of vulnerable people elsewhere without a single dose is dangerous for everyone." It's a persuasive line of argument. However, it has received some pushback. Matt Iglesias, formerly of Vox, shared an article from Bloomberg about South Africa turning away vaccines from Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. He tweeted the following commentary: "The impulse to turn Omicron into a vaccine equity morality tale is blasting through the reality that in South Africa, like the USA, the constraint on vaccination is demand, not supply. They were literally turning away doses earlier this week." Eve Fairbanks, who is a writer based in South Africa, backed up that view. So she tweeted, "Hi from South Africa, birthplace of your newest COVID variant. I see hot takes that South Africa's problem is we don't have enough nice American vaccines. We do not have a problem with vaccine supply. We're turning away vax shipments. Our problem is fear of vaccines, same as you." Fairbank went on to blame high-profile American anti-vaxxers for spreading misinformation, which has become popular in South Africa. So who's right? Is the West hoarding vaccines to blame for South Africa's low vaccination rate, or is it the fault of vaccine skepticism? I asked Fatima Hassan, director of the Health Justice Initiative based in South Africa.
So it may be true that South Africa has sufficient supplies as at November 2021, but that was not the situation in February or March or April or May or June. In fact, for the first 3 quarters of this year, South Africa was drip-fed supplies from Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. For the better part of this year, Johnson & Johnson was unable to deliver contractual promises of its vaccines due to issues with the Baltimore plant, and also because Johnson & Johnson was prioritizing customers in Europe and in North America, so much so that vaccines that were filled and finished in South Africa were actually exported to Europe when South Africa was facing the 3rd wave. The reason why more people are vaccinated with Pfizer, and in fact 10 million people have already received the Pfizer first shot, 8 million people have received the Pfizer second shot, compared to just over about 5 million people who've received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, is because for many months Johnson & Johnson was basically just not delivering vaccine to South Africa. And where it did, it was giving donations of soon to expire stock. That is how we vaccinated teachers in this country. So there's been quite a number of delays in the delivery of supplies. They've come in on a drip feed basis for the better part of 2021. And that had the result of delaying the commencement of our vaccine program in South Africa. And when it did start, because we had scarce supplies, we had to ration. And that is the reason why South Africa started a vaccine program in age cohorts, which also explains why only in the last few weeks it has now started to vaccinate children. So we were a few months behind many of you in the global north in terms of the commencement of your vaccine program. And many of us believe that the delay and the timing actually allowed an anti-vax movement to grow. It's a similar movement that we saw when we dealt with the HIV/AIDS crisis, where people felt that ARVs were not an appropriate way of managing the HIV/AIDS crisis. You'll remember we had a president and a minister promoting garlic and olive oil as a solution instead of ARVs. So we do have the remnants of that particular anti-science movement. But given the changes in the vaccine selection, the vaccines that we were using, given the delays, the different age groups starting at different times, it also created a lot of hesitancy. And there are still people who would are still deciding whether they want to take the vaccine or not. We believe that in the last 72 hours, with the president calling on people to also take the vaccine now, given this new variant, that this is likely to change. But in order to address this, we need a lot of support and a lot of resources to do community literacy and to actually take vaccines to where the people are.
So as I understand it, the hesitancy can't be seen in isolation from the lumpy supply, because the lumpy supply and the constant change of which vaccines were going to be used gave sort of fuel to the anti-vax movement and left a bit of a vacuum. I want to ask about the situation that South Africa currently finds itself in. Obviously, this Omicron variant, we're all talking in the UK, what policy changes will be needed. Does this mean we're going to have to go back into a lockdown? And as I've described, we've got almost 70% of the population double vaccinated. In South Africa, more like 25%. In what state is South Africa to deal with this new variant, which is obviously already much more prevalent there than it is here? How do you assess how South Africa will deal with this?
So what we've had is the president has actually addressed the nation in the last 24 hours, and he's maintained a level 1 lockdown. For those of you unfamiliar with what a level 1 means, is that there's limited restrictions. I mean, it's not a lockdown with severe restrictions. And one of the key things that government is doing to address the issue of the 35 to 42% vaccine rate in adults, depending on how you define a fully vaccinated person, is to consider whether South Africa should actually adopt vaccine mandates. And so I think it goes back to what we were discussing earlier about how do you address, the influence and power of the anti-vax movement as well as vaccine hesitancy amidst a backdrop of where decisions have changed quite often because we're dealing with a pandemic that, nobody could plan, nobody knew about, and we've dealt with quite different decision-making around vaccine selection. So what is on the cards is a possible vaccine mandate, so that we can actually try and get more people vaccinated to deal with the consequences of a variant, which, by the way, the scientists and government scientists are also indicating that we still don't have enough information. So in the last 48 hours, our experts in South Africa have indicated that we don't have enough information to determine whether this variant is more transmissible than previous variants. So, that is still something that is uncertain. I think we have quite advanced genomic surveillance systems. So government is basically relying on the expertise of our scientists to advise it on what other measures it could take, in addition to the normal sort of approach of sharing information with the rest of the world, including the WHO. What is not appropriate, and I think what is rather alarming, was the knee-jerk reaction of many countries to just, simply impose a travel ban. That is not how you deal with variants in a pandemic in an epidemiological or in a scientific way. That is certainly not going to basically get us out of this pandemic, because we're quite advanced in this particular pandemic, right? So that's a situation that we're dealing with.
I wanted to ask about travel bans, because I know there's been a lot of outrage in South Africa that essentially South Africa is being punished for having excellent genomic sequencing capabilities and for having been very honest and open with the world. In a sense, South Africa has done us a favor by discovering this variant. Now we've said, you're a pariah and you can't go anywhere. I do understand that argument. On the other side, I do feel like there is some justification to say if there's a new variant we don't know that much about, let's try and stop it spreading as much as we possibly can. I think when we had the Alpha variant, some countries blocked off travel from the UK as well. Do you think it's just completely out of order in all circumstances to implement a travel ban? Or do you think it could be justified if instead of the UK saying, this is your problem, we're implementing a travel ban, we will implement that ban, but we will compensate you with, a bunch of medical equipment and lots of solidarity, recognizing that you are in a difficult situation right now because you got hit by this variant first, and also to say thank you for discovering this and being so open. Do you think there could be more of a quid pro quo and then the ban would be more acceptable?
I think the issue is that people are enraged in Southern Africa because several countries in Southern Africa were put on multiple travel ban lists immediately. even though the variant has been discovered in other places. And so one of the questions that, for example, Stephanie Nolan from the New York Times had asked was, if the CDC, if the US had discovered this variant with only 22 cases, would the immediate reaction be to place the US on global travel ban list? So we do think that the reaction has been knee-jerk, that the WHO has also indicated that there wasn't sufficient information to immediately respond with a travel ban. So coming to your question of a quid pro quo, I think the reason why people are enraged is because it's an inconsistent application of the travel ban quite late in the pandemic. So you talked about the Alpha variant. That was quite early on in the pandemic, and we're in a very different set of circumstances now in November 2021. And that is what the scientists and experts are saying, that travel bans may have had a role and a place at a certain point in this pandemic quite early on, but it certainly doesn't have a place now. And if you are going to impose a travel ban, then you basically have to impose a universal travel ban and basically stop all travel from all countries, from all places. But that is not what is happening. Even now that we have multiple cases in other parts of the world, mostly it's countries in Southern Africa that are subject to the travel ban. So that's when you have to ask, what is the science behind this? What is the real reason for why countries in Southern Africa are actually being placed on the travel ban? And is there a consideration for the impact that that has and the socioeconomic factors? Now, had there been more of a offer of support, of cooperation, of global solidarity, which is what our genomic surveillance teams had actually suggested, then perhaps we'd be having a different conversation. But what we have is a travel ban without that recognition and without that offer of support. And I think that is the reason why people are just really frustrated, because this is not the first time. There is a sense that throughout this pandemic, we've really been ignored and isolated and subject to a number of discriminatory approaches, including in relation to vaccine access and the prioritization of vaccine supplies for Africa. So I think it's a combination of factors that are making people really impatient and really angry with the global north.
I hadn't got my mic there. I'll say that all over again. That was Fatima Hassan, Director of the Health Justice Initiative. We've got a lot of updates about Keir Starmer's reshuffle. Just while we're putting together that, we have got one story for you first. Do stay tuned, though. You'll get all of the latest updates when it comes to Labour's new front bench. Nadine Dorries, the UK Culture Secretary, is no stranger to controversy. She's a social conservative and opposed to gay marriage. She campaigned to reduce term limits for abortions. She's also a bit of a Twitter troll, having called prominent Liberal journalists fuckwits. But this weekend, she gave an interview to the Daily Mail, which was supposed to show her softer side. The headline for the piece was, "The left loves to demonise Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries, but this intimate interview reveals her very human side." This was, however, not to be an interview which would persuade any or many of Nadine Dorries' critics. Asked about Caroline Noakes alleging she was groped by Boris Johnson's father, Nadine Dorries said the following: "I don't believe it happened. I have known Stanley for 15 years. He is a gentleman. It never happened to me. Maybe there is something wrong with me." Now, the context here, Stanley Johnson has been accused by two women of inappropriate touching. One was Caroline Noakes, she's a Conservative MP. The other was Alva Ray, who was a journalist at The New Statesman. According to Nadine Dorries, though, because it never happened to her, it can't have happened to anyone else. Caroline Noakes wasn't impressed. She told the Press Association the following: "I am very sorry the Secretary of State has used her considerable influence and power in the media to denounce me in this way. I very much hope her attitude does not deter other women from being brave enough to report their experiences of public sexual harassment." Terrible quote from Nadine Dorries there. Ash, what did you make of that, seeing that quote from our Culture Secretary on the weekend?
Nadine Dorries is the protagonist of reality. So if something hasn't happened to her personally, it hasn't happened to anybody. And, that's why, you do have to have an incredibly high threshold to accuse anybody of, any kind of sexual violence. They have to have done it to every woman on the planet for it to have not for it to have happened at all. And I think that's a very sensible threshold to have for taking action on sexual harassment, sexual assault, or indeed rape. And I think it's a really workable policy to have. Unless you've done it to every woman, you've not done it at all.
I know. And she's not going to suffer any consequence for this, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing that you're allowed to say on the front bench. I mean, especially when your boss is the son of the person who is, the accused.
Well, look, I think we've got two issues to separate out. One is the level of tolerance shown for Stanley Johnson's history of misogyny, right? And he does have a history of misogyny. He's been accused by his ex-wife of breaking his nose, and that's breaking her nose. That's Boris Johnson's own mother. You have two women who've come forward with what I think of as fairly credible testimony about being groped. There's, detail. There's, level of consistency in what they're saying. They're two women who also aren't necessarily friends or political allies. They've got absolutely no reason to make any of this stuff up. And yet there is a level of protection afforded to him for two reasons. One is that he is very well liked within conservative circles. He's very well established within conservative circles, and being the father of the Prime Minister gives you a certain amount of leeway which isn't given to other men. He's somebody who makes regular appearances in the media solely because he's Boris Johnson's father. And there is something about that entire ghastly Johnson clan, including the sister Rachel Johnson, the way they pop up on broadcast like a rash, crowing about their access to the Prime Minister's mind in a way that shouldn't happen in any modern democracy. So I think that's why there's a certain level of tolerance for Stanley Johnson, and why, even though you've got, two women, an MP and a journalist at the New Statesman, which should be kind of career ending for anybody to be accused of groping, two women with that level of status and power in society. That's why I don't think that this is going to trouble him very much. Of course, Boris Johnson himself was accused of groping a journalist, Charlotte Edwards. She wrote an article about it, that he reached under the table during a working lunch and groped her thigh and another woman's thigh. Nothing happened. It was memory hold. So I think that there is actually a high level of tolerance for sexual violence, for misogyny, for sexual harassment, when it's politically inconvenient to actually hold the perpetrator accountable. And then the second thing is about Nadine Dorries in particular. So if what Boris Johnson wanted was somebody who wouldn't say things which are completely dunderheaded, someone who could be relied upon to have, a pretty solid grip of the culture brief, know who funds Channel 4, for instance, and, its structure of governance, somebody who understands the BBC and the pressures it's under and wants to see it succeed as an institution, then he wouldn't have appointed Nadine Dorries to the culture brief. She's somebody who has distinguished herself, I think, with a level of viciousness and stupidity, which puts her head and shoulders above many others within the Conservative Party. So that really is some achievement. She's somebody who has mixed me up with another South Asian woman who I look nothing like. It's a grave insult to Faiza Shaheen to suggest that we look the same, quite frankly. And then when pulled up on it, she said that the reason why she thought that we were the same was because of our accents. I mean, do you think that's plausible at all? She's somebody who has, retweeted, horrific, racism, and, had to then unretweet it. She's somebody who has, threatened journalists for asking questions about her daughter being paid with taxpayer money, saying that she'd nailed their bollocks to something, or something like really horrific.
That one passed me by.
Graphic.
Wow.
I think it's a journalist from the Mirror. So she's someone who, throughout her political career, has been characterized by shocking levels of ignorance, and also, I think, really quite alarming levels of vitriol. So, no, there's not going to be any kind of consequence for her, because this is why she's been appointed to the role. She's a nasty piece of work, and that's why she got the promotion.
I mean, I think that's an incredibly persuasive argument and a very good summary. She's a nasty piece of work, and that's why she got the promotion. So, of course, she is not going to suffer professional consequences for saying, oh, no, I don't believe these women got groped by this person because I've never been groped by this person. It's not the kind of thing you should be saying if you're in the cabinet. I mean, it's not the kind of thing you should be saying whatever your job is, but especially not if you're one of the most powerful people in the country. Let's go to the reshuffle. First, we've got one tweet. BMIC will be sold to a Dory donor on the cheap. Then, when it's required, they will clean up. Probably. Very likely. Let's go to our next story, which is about the reshuffle. Keir Starmer started a reshuffle this morning. It seemed a little bit botched at the beginning because he announced it in the middle of an Angela Rayner speech, and then it took ages for any news to emerge. But we do now have quite a lot of updates. There are quite a lot of positions we now know. I think we can get some of them up now. So the big moves are Yvette Cooper has gone to become Shadow Home Secretary. David Lammy has gone to become Shadow Foreign Secretary. Lisa Nandy has gone to the Department for Levelling Up. Wes Streeting to Shadow Health, and Jonathan Ashworth to Shadow DWP. And we should probably mention who they've replaced. So Yvette Cooper has replaced Nick Thomas-Simons. He's gone to be the Trade Secretary. David Lammy has replaced Lisa Nandy, who's gone to Department for Levelling Up. Wes Streeting has replaced Jonathan Ashworth, who's gone to the Department for Work and Pensions. We can go to the next round, the next bunch. We also have Bridget Phillipson, who's gone to Shadow Education. Jonathan Reddles, who's gone to Shadow Business. And this is quite a big one, has pushed Ed Miliband out of the business brief. Ed Miliband is keeping the climate and energy brief, which was part of BASE. It was part of the business department. So this is a bit of a demotion for him. Nick Thomas-Simons, as I say, he's been demoted from Shadow Home Secretary to Shadow Trade, and Emily Thornberry has been demoted from Shadow Trade to Shadow Attorney General. I say demoted. Some people might consider those to be on the same level. Looks like a demotion to me. We've also got Lou Haig has gone to Transport. Ash, we're going to talk about some of the circumstances of this reshuffle today. Any of those moves, do they stand out for you particularly?
I mean, so I think that there's a lot in here that's really interesting because you did have, I think, a lot of people occupying those front bench positions who didn't make much of an impact either politically or in the media. So, Nick Thomas-Simons, I can't really think of something he came out with that really cut through. Lisa Nandy, in terms of the Foreign Secretary brief, I don't think she did an awful lot with that either. There weren't a whole load of punches being landed on Dominic Raab, for instance, over the handling of the Afghanistan withdrawal. It seems that her main role when it came to being Foreign Secretary was kind of setting the boundaries of respectable opinion when talking about Israel and Palestine. And what that meant was shifting things away from a recognition of Palestinian self-determination or indeed a right to self-defense or indeed a realistic view of what's going on, which is a de facto one-state arrangement, and kind of more assertively shifting the Labour Overton window to, what you might describe as liberal Zionism. That's kind of the most distinguished and characteristic thing that she did with the role. So particularly with Yvette Cooper and David Lammy, it's that their politics are not my politics, but they are people with a lot more media cut through than those that they've replaced. Yvette Cooper is, of course, quite interesting in terms of her role during the Windrush scandal. She's credited with asking the sticky questions which brought down Amber Rudd. It's something which I think really helped repair her reputation and advance it. I would be wary, I think, of buying in a little bit too much into the hagiography of Saint Yvette Cooper. She wasn't one of the people who rebelled on the immigration bill, unlike Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, and Diane Abbott, who voted against the Conservative bill, which introduced the hostile environment. She's also somebody who offered a bit of advice to Amber Rudd on how to weather the Windrush scandal, which I think is something which is completely at odds with the spirit of accountability, considering that what Amber Rudd did as Home Secretary is deport Black British citizens essentially on the basis of their race. David Lammy is somebody who I think has carved out something of a media persona for himself as a bit of a liberal hero. I wonder what that's going to do for Labour in terms of its pitch to, the Brexit voting seats it lost in the Midlands and the North. But it's undeniable that he's got media presence. I think maybe even a bit more than Lisa Nandy had. And as for Emily Thornberry, this is sort of emblematic of the muddled up thinking of Keir Starmer. No one can really decide whether Emily Thornberry, and I think this is something which Stephen Bush tweeted, is a liability who needs to be consigned to the backbenches because, she's kryptonite to Brexiters who deserted Labour in 2019, or whether she's a big hitter, somebody who is combative, intelligent, charismatic, and, can do some real damage to the Conservatives. Keir Starmer can't quite decide. So he's sort of putting her in these marginal roles where she's neither one thing or the other. Personally, I think that Emily Thornberry gets an unfair stick. So there was a Labour source briefing today, that she's a London lawyer, Islington Remainer, in very derisive terms. Now, of course, all of those epithets also apply to Keir Starmer. It's just that Emily Thornberry, I think, on account of being a woman, was unfairly dismissed from, being a leadership contender. It went to Keir Starmer, who I think has all of Emily Thornberry's supposed weaknesses and none of her strengths.
I agree with you. This does, from Keir Starmer's perspective, he has replaced some weak media performers with some better media performers. So he can say, this was a professional decision as opposed to a political one. At the same time, I think on the whole, this probably is a shift to the right. David Lammy, Shadow Foreign Secretary, he's someone who voted for the Iraq War. Yvette Cooper, Shadow Home Secretary, she was someone when she had that role under Ed Miliband, who was known to be arguing for tougher lines on migration. Wes Streeting, massive Blairite at Shadow Health. He's clearly to the right of Jonathan Ashworth, and Bridget Phillipson to Shadow Education. Again, she's also sort of like a progress type. It's interesting there that Wes Streeting and Bridget Phillipson have both been given those promotions. They're two of the people most commonly touted as potential successors to Keir Starmer. So clearly, some people around Keir are perfectly happy for them to get their time in the limelight. If you're a Labour politician, being in the education or the health brief, quite good for your career because Labour members tend to like people who talk about education and talk about health because they're classic Labour issues. The Ed Miliband demotion I do think is pretty significant. Clearly, Keir Starmer didn't think he was pro-business enough, so he's taken the business part out of his title. I'm not entirely sure if he's still going to be in the shadow cabinet. That's going to be fairly significant. I assume he will be because it would be seen as too confrontational to tell him to lead on climate change and energy, but just completely hoof him out. So I imagine this was sort of the compromise position. Nick Thomas-Simons to Shadow Trade, no one's going to notice, frankly. He was Shadow Home Secretary, no one noticed. No one's going to notice him in this new role. Let's talk a little bit about one other person who resigned. So apparently she was also demoted from the Shadow Cabinet, but she was allowed to keep her brief until she resigned. It's Kat Smith. So she was the first person to announce she was standing down this morning. She was the only person we knew who was moving. She tweeted, "It's been an honour to serve on the Labour front bench since 2015, but I'm looking forward to spending even more time at home here in Lancashire and standing up for my constituents." Then in the letter she said, "Although I am grateful for your offer to remain in my current brief, I have only been on the backbenches for 4 months in my 6.5 years as an MP, and I will instead be returning to the backbenches." So that my current brief there has been analysed by many people as suggesting she was told she could still work on youth engagement and voter registration, but she'd no longer be in the shadow cabinet. So she decided instead of taking that demotion to resign. And she also said, this is the interesting part, "You will be aware that we had a meeting scheduled for later this week during which I wanted to raise the issue of and my concerns about Jeremy not being readmitted to the Parliamentary Labour Party after he was readmitted into our party membership following due process. This position is utterly unsustainable and it is important that you truly understand how much damage this is causing in constituency Labour parties and amongst ordinary members, a number of whom are no longer campaigning. You will also be aware that I am a long-standing advocate for proportional representation and I am disappointed that we, as a party have not adopted a position which I believe to be fundamentally fairer and very much in keeping with the views of my constituents. Ash, I'm guessing that Cat Smith was probably the last person in the shadow cabinet who had a strong opinion that Jeremy Corbyn should be let back into the PLP. Is it significant that she's now gone?
I think so. I think maybe what this shows is that there's a significant flaw in the stay and fight argument, which is while that might work at a CLP level and why that might be useful in terms of helping people who are on the left get through candidate selections, you don't have adequate representation within the shadow cabinet to stop Keir Starmer drifting to the right in terms of where he wants to, how he wants to fill shadow cabinet roles, breaking the promises that he got elected on, or even just offering basic due process and fairness to somebody like Jeremy Corbyn, his predecessor in the role, the man who was Labour leader when Keir Starmer was quite happy to be a member of his shadow cabinet, not once, but twice, who was responsible for the manifesto that Keir Starmer was happy to stand on in both 2017 and 2019. So I think that in terms of the stay and fight strategy, that is a weakness. There is a lack of leverage within the shadow cabinet and a lack of representation of left-wing views in earshot of Keir Starmer. In fact, he's surrounded by people who tell him that he's doing great only if he's seen to be bashing the left enough. So I don't think that Keir Starmer is going to take Cat Smith's resignation as any particular blow to his authority, because he's going to have people who are, part of that Blairite faction whispering in his ear saying the fact she's gone is great for you. She's no loss.
No doubt. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. Let's go to some super chats. Saul with a $5. Solidarity with my MP, Cat Smith, who resigned from Shadow Cabinet and said Starmer's decision not to reinstate Corbyn is causing damage to CLPs and members. Absolutely right. I think, she comes across very well from today's events. Daniel Goff with a $5. This reshuffle is a bit like how Waitrose have changed their colour scheme and stopped selling white loaves. I suppose, is that saying it's superficial change? Nati with a tenner. Emily Thornberry has very similar credentials to Keir Starmer, yet was not elected Labour leader. Labour isn't ready to have a conversation on internal misogyny. I think that's a very interesting point. I think there are lots of people on the soft left who will think, Emily Thornberry, maybe she would have been a safer bet than Keir Starmer. She's better at attacking the Tories. She seems less viciously right-wing. I don't think she's actually on the left per se, but I think she probably would have been better than Keir Starmer. Let's talk briefly, because this is genuinely, I think, a bit of a Westminster story. No one really, the public don't care about this, but it can be interesting if you're interested in, what happens at the top of Labour politics. And that's because the manner of the reshuffle caused some consternation, as it was launched in the middle of a speech by Angela Rayner on Tory corruption. So lobby journalists pointed this out. They weren't impressed. Normally they quite like Keir Starmer. Sebastian Payne at the FT tweeted, deciding to reshuffle the shadow cabinet while your deputy leader is giving a keynote speech on taking on the Tories is proper galaxy brain stuff from Labour. After this announcement happened, while she was giving a speech, there was also lots of speculation about whether or not Rayner knew she was about to be upstaged, or had she been taken by surprise. Well, she didn't seem to know during her broadcast round this morning. Here she is on Times Radio.
You famously weren't much consulted the last time you had a go at that. Have you been consulted on plans for a reshuffle?
No, I'm not aware of any plans for a reshuffle. I haven't been consulted, so I don't think there's any, focus on that at the moment. Everyone's been focused on holding the government to account and, trying to get to the point where, government ministers and the Prime Minister do the right thing by the country rather than, setting us up to fail. Rachel Reeves, our Shadow Chancellor, has done an amazing job setting out why the Labour Party is the party of business and the party of the UK economy, and we've seen the government really take their eye off the ball. They've, let down the North. They've broken promises on rail, and we've been holding the government to account, and that's what we're focusing on at the moment, not internal what job you've got.
Yeah, you'd expect to hear about it first, wouldn't you, as well, if there was going to be one?
I reckon that Keir would tell me first. Yeah.
So apparently he did tell her first, but without much notice and without any consultation. So we can see here a tweet from Pippa Carrara from the Mirror. She tweeted, "I understand that Keir Starmer met with Angela Rayner in person today before her morning media round and going to the Institute for Government when he specifically told her the reshuffle would be today." I actually think it was after her broadcast round and before her speech is, I think, what people settled on later on. The word told there being quite significant. She potentially wasn't very happy he was about to upstage her, but she had been informed, so it wasn't a complete surprise. People in her team do seem quite pissed off, though. Jack McKenna is her head of comms. He tweeted, "Today's speech is the culmination of many, many weeks of work from a small, talented and dedicated team. I'm very proud of the work we've done to hold the Tories to account for being corrupt and our plan to overhaul the broken system that we have today." So the timing of that tweet suggesting that Angela Rayner's team were kind of annoyed that they were upstaged by this. Ash, I sort of introduced this by saying, all of the lobby journalists were going wild this morning. So like, oh, the timing of the reshuffle, is this... I feel like this is something that's going to be forgotten within about 6 hours. But is the beef between Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner in any way significant here?
It's going to be forgotten by journalists within 6 hours, but I don't think it's going to be forgotten either by Keir Starmer's team or Angela Rayner's team. Labour leaders tend not to do so well when the leader and the deputy leader are at odds with each other. I think regardless of when Angela Rayner was informed of the reshuffle, the fact that she didn't know before her morning media round and the fact that it was timed at the same time as, what was supposed to be a big set piece prominent speech shows that Keir Starmer is more than willing to undermine her. That doesn't, I think, give any comfort to either members or would-be voters who want just to see a bit of unity, to see the party leadership acting in concert with one another. And I think that even if this particular episode is forgotten, it might be a recurring storyline through the months to come. Another thing to bear in mind is that Keir Starmer did reshuffle his cabinet only back in May. And since then, I think, we might have had something like 18 or 19 relaunches of, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. And when that reshuffle went ahead in May, one of the things that was being briefed is that this was supposed to be an election fighting and allegedly election winning shadow cabinet. So the fact that it has gone out the window so quickly, the fact that it was timed in such a way as to undermine Angela Rayner, I think tells you a little bit about either the level of honesty coming from Keir Starmer, or perhaps he's just not that convinced by his own political strategy. That's why he's so vulnerable to being shunted further and further along to the right. Now, I think when it comes to how much this is going to matter, you're right, this doesn't have cut through, but what it does do, I think, is hamstring Keir Starmer's ability to land a proper blow on the Conservatives, particularly on something like corruption and sleaze, where we know that they've had like a little bit of a dip in the polls. That would be something which would make common sense to keep hammering them on. But instead, he's plucked defeat out of the jaws of victory and handed the press another Labour infighting story.
Someone in the comments has correctly said that I misread Pippa Carrara's tweet. I said that she said Angela Rayner was told before her morning media round. In fact, Pippa Carrara says she was told between her morning media round and her speech. So I got that wrong. Although I tried to correct Pippa Carrara, even though I just misread her in the first place. So apologies if you're watching. Let's go to our final story. I'm sure we'll come back to the politics of the Labour shadow cabinet on a future show soon. Piers Corbyn, oddball brother of Jeremy, has come to prominence of late due to his anti-lockdown and anti-vaccine activism. He is a wrong 'un. However, while Piers Corbyn's opinions might be wrong, a video released this weekend shows his musical talent is even worse. Take a look at this crime against musicality.
Do you know, wearing a mask is like trying to keep a fart in your trousers. Wearing a mask is like trying to keep a fart in your trousers. Wearing a mask is like trying to keep a fart in your trousers. Wearing a mask is like trying to keep a fart in your trousers. Wearing a mask is like trying to keep a fart in your trousers. What is it like
It's like trying to keep a fart in your trousers. What is it like? It's like trying to keep a fart in your trousers. Wearing a mask. It's like trying to keep a fart in your trousers. Wearing a mask. It's like trying to keep a fart in your trousers. What is it like? It's like trying to keep a fart in your trousers. What is it like? It's like trying to keep a fart in your trousers.
So, New World Order, we've never followed any of your mad dictates, and we never will.
Resist, defy, do not comply. Resist, defy, do not comply. Resist, defy, do not comply. Freedom, freedom.
Ash, your face. I'm sorry I subjected you to that.
You know, there are thousands of people at Wembley right now listening to WizKid, and I'm here listening to Piers Corbyn's caterwauling. And
Wearing a
I've never
mask.
regretted joining Novara Media more.
Wearing a mask is like trying to... Is wearing a mask like trying to keep a fart in your trousers?
What, like, one, no. Two, the logic is that because farts exist, that no one should be wearing trousers. And in fact, it's desirable, more desirable to fart with your trousers off. Three, it's comparing your face to a fart, right?
No, that point's actually quite important, because if someone were to fart on me, especially like in a public place, I would prefer them to be wearing trousers.
I would prefer.
And the same as if someone were to cough or speak on me on the tube, you know, given that we're in the middle of a pandemic, I would prefer them to be wearing a mask. So the analogy doesn't work.
I don't know. I think there's also something like, you know, I saw Piers Corbyn and some of his anti-vax COVID denialist mates pitch up at TWT, and there ended up being a bit of a melee. And I think that, sure, part of this motivation might be ideological, but I think that there is just like a very neurotic need for attention. Like, I don't think this is coming from a place which is rational or particularly ideological. I think that there's something within these fringe circles about being seen and just being prominent, even if all you are is a big fish in a small pond. And kind of seeing all of those, you know, deranged gazes looking up at the camera, singing their song, which didn't make sense, completely locked out. You know, they couldn't find no key. I just think there's got to be something, I don't know, in the childhood explaining some of this stuff.
Ash, can I get you to move your mic ever so slightly? It's sort of going into your cheek instead of into your face. There we go. That's much better. Well, now we muted you. I don't know why we did that. Oh, we lost you. Oh, that was a shame. I wish I didn't say anything now. Are we going to wrap up there, Fox? Or are we going to get Ash back? Oh, let's have a look. We got some comments. Perfect. Muse and Vent tweets on the hashtag TiskiSour. The naughty Omicron variant didn't get the memo that the UK government wants us to forget about COVID and go back to commuting long hours on expensive packed trains and working crowded offices built by Tory donor developers and owned by Tory donor landlords without ventilation. It's a very good summary of what we've been talking about on tonight's show. And then we have a super chat. On Palestine Day, let's urge our government to recognise the state of Palestine, oppose the illegal occupation, pressure the state of Israel to lift the siege of Gaza, and support Palestinian human rights. And yeah, today is International Day of Solidarity with Palestinian People, organised by the UN. And I think it is to commemorate the adoption by the Assembly in 1947 of Resolution 181, which provided for the partition of Palestine into 2 states. Are we getting Ash back, or we've lost Ash? We've lost Ash, which means the show is over. Done. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you for your super chats and your tweets. We'll be back on Wednesday at 7 p.m. You've been watching TiskiSour on Novara Media. Good night.